Welcome to Shadow of Truth. And today is Thursday, September the 24th, 2015. And your hosts are Dave Kranzler and Rory Hall. And we are very honored to have a returning guest, Dr. Paul Craig Roberts. And how are you doing today, Mr. Roberts?
I'm doing fine, thanks, Roy.
And I wanted to start out, you had released an article on Sunday, and I want to read a couple of lines from that article, and it was called "All Republican Presidential Candidates Stand for War." And this is a direct quote from your article. It says, "There is not a peaceful person among the Republican candidates. Even the female is heartless. Carly Fiorina positioned herself alongside the macho men as a warmonger." And I'm going to stop right there, Dr. Roberts. And with the escalated position by the Pentagon and the current set of warmongers in the White House and Congress, what will it take to avoid a nuclear war? Because it seems like we are moving headlong into war with Russia and possibly China.
I think what it will take is the European countries realize that they've been enabling American aggression in the 21st century, aggression that has now brought them millions of refugees particularly from Syria and Iraq. They can't cope with these refugees. And it's also brought them into conflict with Russia, both economic and political, which is not in the interest of Europe, and militarily. We now have our German puppets flying German jet fighters over the Baltic skies along Russia's border, I suppose trying to show that we're tough and intimidate the Russians. And all of this is nonsensical for Europe. So it's possible that they will come to the conclusion that being a vassal of Washington doesn't pay. It's brought them a flood of refugees. I've seen estimates, Rory, that there's as many as 10 million Syrian refugees. I don't know if that's possible or not, but that's the kind of number that is now in the media. And of course, there are also refugees from Iraq because we so destabilized that country. There are refugees from Libya. There'll be from Somalia, from Yemen, from Pakistan, Afghanistan. So Europe is really catching the brunt of this on the refugee front. And they've been hurt by the sanctions that the United States has forced Europe to put on Russia. These sanctions really don't do much to Russia, but they hurt Europe. And now they're faced with this saber rattling on the part of Washington, which could bring them into a military conflict, which, of course, would mean almost instant destruction for all of Europe. So maybe they'll simply wise up and say, despite all the money the Americans pay us, we can't afford to be their vassals. So that would bust up the cover that Washington needs for its wars, and it would bust up its forward bases, and it really wouldn't be able to cause the kind of troubles it's causing now. It would just have to sit back and push the button. And of course, Russia and China would be very alert to that, and it's unlikely that Washington could get away with that. But that's my view of it.
And basically, what you just basically described with the refugees is an invasion of Europe. And what role should these individual nation states play, if any, other than to protect their borders from an onslaught of these immigrants, refugees? I mean, you're talking about 10 million people. I mean, how do you even deal with that?
Well, it's the Europeans' own fault. They deserve it. I don't think they have any right. I don't think they have any right to protect their borders. They're stupid. people, stupid governments. It was their participation in Washington's Middle Eastern wars that enabled this. If Washington had done this on its own, it would have been universally announced as a war criminal. But it used cover. It had NATO cover. This is a NATO thing. This is a war on terror. This is a coalition of the willing. It has to have accomplices so that it looks like some kind of a unified, justified action. And without that, it couldn't have happened. So Europe brought it on themselves, and I don't think they can do anything about it because the EU itself requires on humanitarian grounds that political refugees be accepted. And so the EU now is squabbling among themselves about the various quotas, who has to take how many. And a few of the Eastern European countries have rejected taking any. So that's already put them in each other's throats. That's a sign of stress on EU membership. And so with any luck, this refugee crisis that the idiot Europeans brought on themselves, as I say, they deserve every bit of it and more. This may break up the EU. If that were to happen, NATO would be gone. If NATO's gone, Washington's cover is gone, and its forward bases are gone, and its power really disappears. So let's hope that they get 20 million, 30 million.
Whatever it takes.
Whatever it takes. Those countries are so corrupt. They're so stupid. It's an amazing thing that they cut their own throat by allowing Washington to force them into sanctions on Russia that hurt their own businesses, their own economies, which are suffering. The unemployment rates in Europe are dramatic. They're so high. And why did they do this? I mean, what do they gain? They gain nothing. So we've created we've orchestrated a Russian threat in order to keep the $1 trillion U.S. military security complex budget funded. How does that benefit Europe?
Dr. Roberts, you're right. I mean, the sanctions have really affected the EU economy, and especially Germany. I mean, just earlier this week, the 5-year German sovereign bond, the Bund, if you will, actually went down into a negative yield. I mean, it's got a negative interest rate on it, and that's a direct reflection of just how weak the German economy is.
Yeah, and I think it must also be a reflection of distrust of banks and currency scare, because why would you pay more for a bond than it's worth?
I agree with that, and I said the same thing back in 2008 because short-term rates in the U.S. went negative right before the big financial de facto collapse that we had. And I was telling people, I said, look, people are taking their money out of money market funds and out of banks and putting them into short-term treasuries. And the fact that interest rates are negative are telling you that they're willing to pay for the safety of knowing that they'll get their money back, because at the very least, the U.S. government would print money to let those to mature those, to pay off those securities. And so it tells you that people are not concerned about the return on their money. They're willing to pay an insurance premium in the form of a negative rate or a higher price than par for a bond. A much higher, essentially a price that gives you a negative rate for a bond in order to have the safety of knowing that they're going to get their money back. And you're right. We're seeing that out to 5 years in Germany, and that's kind of a frightening prospect.
To get their money back in nominal terms. In
nominal terms, correct.
Now,
correct,
of course,
because the governments will print money to pay that back. But I just wanted to circle back really quickly to something that you had mentioned, and that was you thought that if the EU were to reject the U.S. and NATO were to break up, it might defang the poisonous snake that is the U.S. Why do you think that the U.S. doesn't think that it can't operate unilaterally? I mean, it basically is operating unilaterally anyway, and they're enjoying the luxury of the NATO cover. But don't you think the U.S. will press on even if NATO goes away?
No, because they won't have air bases, naval bases. Their supply lines become impossible.
I'm not talking about conventional war here, Dr. Roberts. I'm talking about if I had the right button, I could launch a bomb from my living room that could hit Russia.
Well, I think without cover, you see, you become a war criminal. And then you have to worry about just being isolated and spurned by the rest of the world. So I think without the empire, Washington hasn't the power because it then is exposed as a criminal state. And launching nuclear weapons, I mean, even if somehow Washington is spared, just the consequence of that terrifies everybody and just makes them hate and distrust you. So I think it would backfire on Washington, even if it was militarily successful. I think, too, that when you're faced with initiating a nuclear war and you don't have any allies, it doesn't work politically. People just get cold feet, baby.
That doesn't seem to bother the people who drafted the Wolfowitz Doctrine.
Yeah, I know, but...
And those are the people that are in there in power.
But there are a lot of other people there, too, and that kind of influence fades when it becomes isolated.
Is there anyone
to say that we're going to prevent the rise of other powers is different from saying we're going to nuke them. And it's too late to prevent the rise. And Washington would have to simultaneously attack Russia and China because I think the two countries, Russia and China now, I think they have a military alliance. And so if they attacked Russia, China would be expecting the same thing for the same reasons. So they would have to attack both, and then that opens you to retaliation from two nuclear powers. And both the Russians and the Chinese have got subs off our coast. So it's not a winnable situation. And I think that even though Washington is rattling all these sabers and demonizing Russia, I don't think they really want to push it to war. He may get away from it. But I think that what they're trying to do is to make Russia sort of capitulate partly and start following Washington's lead, like Russia did when Yeltsin was the president. I think this can get away from them, and it can ruin relations for Europe and Russia, and consequently, it could result in ruining relations between Europe and the U.S. So I think a lot of this is we just keep putting pressure on them. We keep putting pressure, and eventually they'll want to resolve it and agree to kind of follow our lead, and then we basically have not a complete vassal, but a semi-vassal, and we can live with that. That may be in Washington's mind, but when you start destroying trust between nuclear powers, you are facing a massive possibility of miscalculation. The risks are great. I think I've remarked before that one of the things every American president since John Kennedy did was to try to build trust between the nuclear powers so that some sort of miscalculation would not result in the use of those weapons. But what we have seen happen since Clinton is the destruction of trust between nuclear powers, not just the United States and Russia, but also United States and China. And Russia and China are so heavily armed with nuclear capability that it becomes an act of madness when you destroy this kind of trust. And if the Europeans were paying attention, this would disturb them greatly too, and they would pull back just for that reason, because Europe would be the first to go.
What did you make of the move by the U.S. that it's apparently going to move 20 extremely powerful nuclear bombs into Germany? 20 more, actually.
Yeah,
apparently they're going to be pointed at Russia.
It's just more needless provocation, and it's more cover. We're getting more countries complicit. Germany is essentially the strong man of the EU and the leader. And so here we have the leader of the EU arming up with American nuclear weapons. And so it's just another reckless, thoughtless action. It threatens Germany. And it threatens all of Europe, because the Russians will simply target that. And the anti-ballistic missile defense that we hype, that can't stop the cruise missiles. And the Russian nuclear cruise missiles can take out all of Europe. So the anti-ABM systems that we're putting in Poland and I think Romania, places like that, that it can't do anything for the Europeans. So they're exposed. We keep exposing them more. We expose them to nuclear war, to economic hurt from sanctions, to millions of refugees from our endless wars. I mean, we've destroyed essentially 7 countries, and the populations there, they're subject to ongoing, continual violence, either from us or from these jihadists or the Islamic State, in Libya, the various factions. There's no government. It's just warlords fighting one another. Nobody's safe anywhere. So they're getting out. And you can't live in that type of a situation. And the infrastructure is destroyed, the water supplies, sanitation, medical. So people leave and they go where they can. And there's nothing Europe can do about it. There's just too many of them. And now we're seeing that the Europeans are as heartless as anyone else. So I don't think that the Europeans have the head screwed on right to accept all this punishment so that the United States can exercise hegemony in the world.
I wanted to ask you, Dr. Roberts, you had said a moment ago that there were other voices in Washington, D.C. that would counterbalance the warmongers. And who are those? Who are they? I mean, are there voices of reason within that criminal cesspool known as Washington, D.C.?
I wouldn't go so far as to say there are voices of reason, but there's anxiety. Look, even Kissinger and Brzezinski have said that the United States is pushing Russia too hard. Both of them have said that Ukraine is an integral part of Russia. And then we start messing around with integral parts of Russia, it's too much. So the two so-called war hawks, and both of them are regarded as war criminals by a lot of people.
Yep.
And yet we've got Kissinger and Brzezinski both saying this is going too far. And I'm convinced that there are a lot of senior generals who really wonder about a war in which there's no survivors. If there's no survivors, there's no
the point?
So what's the point? And at some point, it has to dawn even on the stupid kind of people that the Republicans are running for president that, really? we're fighting among ourselves as to which one of us is willing to push the button first. Do we really want to do this? What benefits from it? So I think, plus the American people, they probably don't take any of this seriously yet because they may not quite understand the consequences, intended and unintended. But I think it can all close down on them. You know, the neocons are dominant because of the think tanks they control, the publications, and because most of them have been in high positions in the Defense Department, the State Department, the National Security Council. So they have all those kinds of connections. They're connected to the military security complex. But see, even the military security complex don't really want a war. They just want an enemy that we have to have an endless buildup to contend with. If you actually go to war and it's nuclear, then they don't gain either. I mean, it's no good having a big budget if you're not there. So
yeah, if you've been evaporated, it makes it kind of hard to spend the money.
Yeah. So I think the real danger is that all those guys, all those neocons, and all these aggressive actions convinces Russia and China that they're going to be attacked. Once they get convinced of that, they may not wait. And so they may launch it just in a preemptive way. So I think this is the reason that Kennedy and Khrushchev, when they saw this coming into play in both countries over the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they said, we got to stop this. This has to stop. And then you saw how hard Richard Nixon worked to create detente, to create relationships with Russia. You remember, he went to China.
Yep.
This really upset the military security complex because they thought it would result in a cut in their budget. You can't eliminate enemies and have the same budget. And Carter was not aggressive, and even though Brzezinski was over there causing trouble in Afghanistan for the Russians, and Reagan really said, we're going to bring this to a halt. We can't go on anymore. And he did. He brought it to a halt. And the George Herbert Walker Bush people respected that. But when Clinton came in, he broke all the agreements. He stuck NATO on Russia's border, despite the promise not to do that. George Bush pulled out of the ABM treaty. He redid the American nuclear doctrine so that the weapons were no longer a retaliatory force. They became a preemptive first strike force. All these types of things are really worrisome. It should be worrisome to us. It's certainly worrisome to the Russians, and Putin has remarked on them over and over and over. And so when you persist in this, and we have these war plans for a nuclear attack on China, and we make it public, and what's the point of that? You know, so I kind of come to the conclusion that hubris and arrogance inside the American government has recreated the nuclear threat that many American presidents worked to diffuse. It's all back now. And what kind of stupid thing will Washington do next? There's no telling. That's like Dave said, they've now put new upgraded nuclear bombs in Germany. Well, the Russians aren't going to sit there while we load up nuclear bombs on an airplane and send them to Russia. They're just not going to sit there and wait on that. So the whole thing is pointless. It just creates risk for life on the planet. You know, all life, not just us, but everything. And why does the government do this? Clearly, the government has no intelligence. It's got no integrity, no sense of morality. So what is it? What is this government? How long can the world tolerate it? I mean, it's evil. You know, if you really look at it, Washington represents the most concentrated form of evil in human history.
Thank you for listening to part 1. And if you'll click the screen where it says to click here, you can get over to part 2 of this incredible conversation. Thank you so much.